Today we're going to be talking about Joshua taking out 31 kings. And so it's all started with Abraham, God giving him this promise, and he says, I'm going to multiply thy seed like the sand of the earth. And so he gave him this great promise, and this is the continuation of this journey. First it was from Abraham, and then to Isaac, and then to Jacob. Jacob was also called Israel, and so whenever you hear the children of Israel, it's referring to Jacob. And so Moses was leading the children of Israel out of the hand of Pharaoh in Egypt. And so that was a mass exodus, a mass leaving out of Egypt. And so Moses took them away from there. They wandered in the wilderness. And then now Moses had them right up to the east side of the Jordan, right up there to cross over. And some of the spies were sent out. They sent 12 spies. 10 of them said, this is terrifying. There's giants in the land. There's the sons of Anak. Giants. They're like, God just sent us out here to die. So 10 of the spies came back, said, don't do it. It's not worth it. Don't go there. And I was mistaken saying they were at the Jordan River. This is actually just before there, just south of the Dead Sea, at Mount Seir or Edom. They went west, or a little bit northwest, to Kadesh Barnea, which was just barely touching into that promised land area, and they saw those giants there, and they were terrified. So they came back, they said, don't do it, but then 2 of the spies were faithful. 2 of them said, let's do it. We're going to go into that promised land, we're going to get what God has promised to us, we're going to fulfill that promise that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, then to Jacob, and then Moses wasn't able to fulfill it for us, but we're going to fulfill this. Those 2 said, let's go ahead and take those lands. And those 2 spies were Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh. And so those 2 spies said, let's do it. They went along and they came over to that east side of the Jordan River. And God said that, Moses, you will get to see that land. You could just see the Jordan. But I will not let you cross over because you did not follow exactly what I had said. Because God had said, I want you to speak to the rock, not to strike it. And Moses decided he was going to strike it. And from that point forward, God said, you will not get to inherit or to go into that promised land. And one of those spies, Joshua, who had said, go into the land, he went ahead and took the children of Israel into that promised land. And so the first step of getting over that Jordan is something you have to realize is this was a raging river. This was something that you could not just decide to swim across. You would drown. You would get washed away and you wouldn't make it. And they needed to get an entire army onto the other side, onto the west side of that Jordan River into the promised land. And so the first step was God had told Joshua to tell them, he says, what I want you to do is to take those 7 high priests that are carrying the ark, and I want you to have them put their feet in the water, in that raging water, where it's still a little bit calm, and I want them to put their feet in the water, and what I'll do is I'll stop up the water. And so Joshua went ahead and said, go ahead and do what God has commanded us to do. They put their feet in that water, the water stopped up, and the children of Israel were able to cross as long as the 7 high priests were following what God had commanded of them to do. So the children of Israel crossed while they're just waiting there. And then Joshua said, what I want you to do is he chose a person from each of the tribes, of the 12 tribes of Israel. And he says, I want you to go back and I want you to grab a stone out of that riverbed. And it says where the place where the feet of the high priests were standing. So somewhere in that area, they go ahead and they grabbed a stone with them, carried it back over onto the west side of Jordan where they were heading, and they set it there as a memorial so they could remember how God had delivered them in that day to be able to get into that promised land. And then after they had done so, the seven priests that were carrying the ark, they were able to take it across into that promised land. And now they have an incredible military advantage. They are now 6 miles just west of their first city that they're about to conquer. Just 6 miles, and you can imagine how Jericho felt about that. They had their massive 50-foot high walls, according to archaeology, not according to biblical accounts. But they said that, so with these 50-foot high walls, they decided, we're not going to let anybody out. We're just going to keep them all in here, because these people just miraculously just crossed the Jordan River, and this is terrifying. Here comes these people where God is clearly on their side. We're just going to hide out, and we're not going to let anybody out or anybody in. Okay, and so God had exact instructions for them. And when God gives exact instructions, you should follow that to the T. You should do exactly what God has commanded you, and He will give you what He has promised to you. So God, what He said is He said, okay, what I want you to do, children of Israel, is I want you to take the armed men, and then they're going to go before the 7 priests with trumpets of ram's horns. So you have the armed men, then you have the Ark of the Covenant being carried along by the high priests, and then the people in the rearward portion. And so some people, they think that it was the Ark of the Covenant first, but to me that seems a little silly. Why would you put out your most precious item, the thing that can be taken from you, right there to be taken? So what you would do is you'd put your armed men first. It was a very logical decision. And so God set up this lineup that He wanted the people to cross and circle around the city. So the first day He said, what I want you to do is I want you to circle around the city once. And those 7 priests with 7 trumpets of ram's horns, I want you to be blowing your horns. And so they're going away, blowing around, blowing their trumpets. And then God said, now I want you to do this for 6 days. And so each day, they crossed around once, and then they finished. And on the 7th day, they circled it 7 times, and all with one accord, they shouted with one voice. And also a detail I didn't mention is that during that entire time, up until that 7th day, they were not to speak. They were not to utter one word so that they could all shout with one voice, and God would be on their side. And do you know what happened? That wall, so if this is the inside of that wall, it fell flat, and it fell outwards. It did not fall inwards, it fell outwards. And archaeology also supports this, as well as Bible verses also support this as well. And then once they had made it in there as well, and the reason I say that there's a Bible verse that supports it is that it says that they went up into the city. They went up into the city. So what that happened is there was a stone retaining wall right below there, full of hard stones that could be a great foundation. And then there was a mud wall on top of that wall. And so when that mud fell flat, it created a ramp up into the city when that mud fell flat outwards. And so they went up into the city, and they burnt it up with a fervent heat. And God had only one commandment of them, was He said, what I want you to do is, this was the one thing to avoid at the very least, the one commandment to avoid, is He says, I don't want you to take of the cursed things. There's several things that you should not touch, or not take into your own. It was God said, do not take the silver, the gold, vessels of brass and iron. They are to go into the treasury of the Lord. But there's a problem. One man was going to spoil it for the rest. This man, his name is Achan, Achan. He decides he's going to take of these cursed things. And he goes ahead, he takes it, and he's just like, oh, that's a goodly Babylonian garment. Look at the stitch work on that. It's just fantastic. So he decides, I'm going to take that Babylonian garment. That's mine. And he's like, oh, look at that silver and gold. And he had some under his tent. He put some in his tent and hid it amongst his tent. He had taken of the cursed things. And so now they're like, yep, we've conquered Jericho. This is great. So then they sent out spies to Ai. So now the next person on the line, the next kingdom to take out, or king, is Ai. So Joshua sends out spies to Ai, and they suggest that only a few thousand should go up. We'll just send out only 3,000. We'll just send out 3,000, and they should be able to take care of Ai. But if God was on their side, they should have been able to conquer Ai. Right after that, they should have been able to send that 3,000, and they should have been victorious. But what happened? They came up with their 3,000 to Ai, and it says that they chased them away, and 36 men of the children of Israel died. And you might think, of 3,000, 36 men, that's not a lot. But the thing is, when God was on their side, it was just an absolute, total victory. And so 36 men of the people died. They turned away. They're like, we're not supposed to be dying off. So they turned back, and they said, Joshua, something's wrong. We're dying. We're not winning. And Joshua immediately knew that something was wrong. He didn't consult with the Lord before they went to Ai. He'd consulted with God before he went into Jericho. He talked with God. But before going into Ai, he just said, yeah, just send the 3,000. But if Joshua would have contacted God and prayed to Him and said, should we send people up? I'm convinced God either would have provided no response, which that should have been a scary response, or He would have said, do not go up, for Achan has taken of the cursed things. And so what did they have to do? What did they have to do in order to defeat Ai? So what they had to do is they had to cleanse it out. They had to cleanse the curse. And so what they did is they took all the children of Israel and they lined them up and they put them out there, and then they found Achan and they took him, his family, everything associated with Achan, his tents, everything, his animals, and they piled it up and they burnt it. They burnt it in front of everybody. They cleansed this curse. And you might say that is super harsh. But the thing is, those 36 people should not have died. That was Achan's fault. They should not have died. That was the way that they had to purify that and to rid themselves of that curse. Okay, and I also want to talk a little bit about the archaeology behind Jericho. There's an absolutely fantastic resource on this on YouTube to learn a little bit more about the archaeology. And so the first step is I want to talk to us about the first archaeologist who looked at Jericho. And in current day, this place is called Tel El Sultan. It's a real place that you can go and visit where Jericho once was. And in the 1930s, this man named John Garstang, he went there and he dated Canaanite pottery to the late Bronze Age or the 1400s. And this is the date that it was supposed to be for the biblical account. And it matched. In the 1930s, John said, I have proven this. I've proven that Jericho is true. And then 20 years pass. Get out of the way, cat. It's messing with my cords. 20 years pass, and the Jewish state of Israel is founded. And this sparks archaeological interest. John Garstang, he proves it. 20 years pass, and Jewish state of Israel is founded. And they're like, oh, this is great. Let's do some more archaeology. Let's prove what we really believe in. And so they send out this lady named Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s. And she was actually a colleague of Garstang. And she claims the pottery is dated 1550. This is 150 years after the biblical accounted year. So this is problematic here. And so she's saying, John Garstang, you're wrong. The pottery is not right. I've dated it to a different period. And what I want to say real quick here is the verse 2 Corinthians 4, verse 3 through 4. It says, but if our gospel be hid, it is hid to them that are lost, in whom the God of this world hath blinded their minds of them which believe not, lest the light of the glorious gospel of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine unto them. So I believe that Kathleen Kenyon, I believe the gospel was hid to her. I believe that she was not able to find the right things. And in fact, and the Bible even explains that to those that it's hidden to, it says, lest the glorious light of the gospel of Christ should shine upon them, or should shine unto them. And so clearly, it's better if they just didn't even know God. It's better if it's better if they're not even born than having to go to hell and to not follow God. And so Kathleen Kenyon, she says it's not true. John Garstang says it's true. And this is the problem with putting too much weight on archaeology and not as much on faith. So people go, in the 30s, they go, yeah, look at that. The biblical account is true. The Bible must be true. This is great. 20 years pass. Somebody else says the opposite. They said, the biblical account is fake. I'm dating it to 1550, 150 years after, when Joshua wouldn't have even been born. You know, this is pretty problematic here, isn't it? Some people, they just go and whatever way the wind blows, they decide that's what archaeology I will follow. That's the consensus, because the consensus with John Garstang is everybody said that's true. The consensus was Kathleen Kenyon did this. Everybody said that's true. Don't you see the flaw in just saying, oh, most people believe this, that must be true? That's problematic. Okay, next one is even another guy later comes out, and his name is Brian Wood. And he actually, what he does is he gets his PhD in late Bronze Age pottery, or in the 1400s, when Joshua account is supposed to match the biblical account. And so he gets his PhD in the exact pottery that should prove the account. And sure enough, he tracks down as much of Garstang's pottery that he could, because a lot of this pottery, it was spread out. It was taken to all these different museums, and they said, oh, this is the pottery of Jericho. So they took some to the Louvre in France, and they took some to other places and all these different museums. So Brian Wood, had to go and track down this pottery. So he goes down, and he finds this pottery, and he proves it. He says, I've proven the biblical account again. And so you see the problem. Oh, I believe in it. This is great. 20 years pass. Oh, I don't believe in it. And then later another guy goes, yes, it's true. Now I believe in it again. This is really problematic here. So I want you to be careful with archaeology, and I want you to put all your trust in the Bible, and that your faith can grow. Okay. Another kind of interesting theory I wanted to mention is that some people think that the way that the water was dammed up, when the high priest put their feet in the water, some people said, well, how did that occur? Some people say that the Jordan River, it runs down a tectonic place. This is where different plates under the earth, that's where they meet. They're saying that's why there's a river that runs through there, because of these tectonic plates, the way they meet. And they're saying, and at those locations where two tectonic plates meet, this is occasionally where the earth will shift or break or move around, and this causes an earthquake. And so some people think that maybe God caused there an earthquake to stop up the water, to dam up the water. To me, it actually doesn't matter very much. As if it says that God did it, I believe that he did it. I don't care if he decided to make the water just freeze in its place or how he did it. But some people get so fixated on the little aspects. I decide to keep a childlike faith because it's not a salvational topic of how God did it. So I just I'll take God for his word for it. Okay. Next one. Oh, and here's the verse about, I mentioned how there's the stone retaining wall and how the mud brick wall fell flat, and how they went up into the city. Joshua 6, verse 20. So the people shouted when the priests blew with the trumpets, and it came to pass when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, and the people shouted with a great shout, that the wall fell down flat, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. So it's pretty neat detail there. So that's Jericho for you, in the amazing miracle that allowed them to do so. And then in Joshua chapter 8, we learn about the next battle. Jericho has been conquered. Now we're on to Ai. Achan took of the cursed things, so they were having some difficulties. They've cleansed Achan, and then God says, now I'm going to give you a strategy. I'm going to tell you, just like Jericho, of how you had to circle the city, and this is the exact instructions. I'm going to give you exact instructions of how you're going to take out Ai. And so what God did is he said, what I want you to do is I want you to set some people out on one side of the city, and I want you to pretend like you're being beat. So the people of Ai said, yes, we've got them on the run, because they're pretending like they're being beat. So that all the armed men and all the people of Ai came out, and they were following they're following them out and saying, we've got them on the run. But as they were following out of their city and all the armed men had left, guess what? There was people waiting as God had instructed them on the side of the city, and they came up, and there's some even on the back of the city, and they came up and they went into the city, and the people all the armed men who'd went out to chase out the children of Israel, they looked back and they saw that their city was smoking. It was up in flames, and they had taken it. So they turned around, and when they turned around, the children of Israel who are faking it, who are doing this great acting role, they chased them down. So a perfect strategy. God had quite the chess game going on here of how to navigate this. So now they have conquered Ai, they've conquered Jericho. Now they're on to the next battle. So before we get to the next battle, it's important to talk about the Hivites that dwelt in Gibeon. So what they did is they sent out these deceiving ambassadors to lie about the distance, which was actually just 3 days away. And so they came out, and what they did is they said, we're going to take some wine, and we're going to bring it with us. We're going to pretend like we're ambassadors for our people that are in a faraway land, even though we're just 3 days away. We're going to pretend, and this is how we're going to get protection against this raging people, the children of Israel, who are coming through, who can have a God that stops up the water, who can yell and blow down a city. And they were terrified. So they wisened up, and they sent some people pretending to be ambassadors. And then they brought this wine it was rent. It was bad. And they also brought their food that was moldy. Some bread that was moldy. They had shoes on that were all tattered up and torn up. Their clothes were old. It'd be like you just go in and finding the nastiest, dirtiest clothes you can possibly find. And they pretended like they came from a long journey. And they said, we're from a faraway land. I want you to make a league with us that you'll protect us. And we'll protect you. And we'll have this relationship going on. And the children of Israel, they said, okay, that's fine. We'll make a league with you. And then sure enough, 3 days later, they found out these people that had come from the faraway journey was 3 days away. They had lied to them. But God said, you've held to your promise. Do not hurt them. Hold to your promise. And not only that did God want them to hold to their promise, God was going to actually protect those people that had deceived the children of Israel because they had made a promise to them to take care of them. And another interesting detail about these Hivites, they were in a royal city. This was a main compound, I almost said compost, main compound amongst the Amorites. And the 5 Amorite kings said, the royal city, the Hivites, they've turned on us. They became allies with the children of Israel. So they said, these 5 Amorite kings that are within the land, they came out and they said, we're going to take out the Hivites. They came out to take out the Hivites. The Hivites told Israel, they said, oh, great, this is bad news. We need to go tell Israel, come help us and take care of us. Children of Israel, they came out, they took care of them, and not only that, God killed more people with hailstones from above than even the children of Israel could kill. God delivered those Hivites away because the children of Israel had made this promise to them, and God wanted them to hold on to that promise. So now and then after they'd killed off those 5 Amorite kings, or actually I want to spend one more minute about those 5 Amorite kings. The 5 Amorite kings, God had delivered them, and they all congregated, just the 5 kings, and they'd come into a cave. I don't know if there's any servants amongst them, but it says the 5 kings all gathered together. They're hiding away in a cave. They've been beaten. They were trying to hide away. And Joshua, this says so much about the personality of him. He says, what I want you to do is he took some of his armed men, and he says, put your foot on their necks. Put your foot on them. And he's just like, it was just so symbolic of the amount of power of God. And then they killed those 5 kings. Okay. Now the next one. Now we're on to the Anakims. And there's just a couple brief verses. And it says, and they killed the Anakims. And these were those same people that the 10 children of Israel, or the 10 spies had said previously, don't go into the land. Don't go because there's the children of Anak. And now they just said casually in a verse or two, they said, yeah, and we took out the children of Anak. So that happened. And then Joshua chapter 12, verse 7 through 24, it talks about all 31 kings that had been conquered. And one of these included Hatzor. And Hatzor was it's a very interesting story as well. So now we're into the next part of this step, which is talking about, actually before I got to the Anakims, it talks about Hatzor. Sorry, I have my timeline a little mixed up there. Hatzor was this amazing, powerful city. This was the king of Canaan, or at least his son is referred to as the king of Canaan. And Jabin was this king. And he had a lot of power under his belt. And let's see if I can hold this up. Losing my battery's dying here. See if I can make it through the last little bit. So he said, what I want you to do is I want to gather all the different kingdoms all around me, all the people, all my little tributary kingdoms. And he goes, I want this kingdom and this kingdom and this kingdom. Come and help us fight the children of Israel. And the children of Israel conquered this king who had so much control and so much power and so much ability to call on other kings. And they delivered them and beat them. And not only that, God had this fervent heat that in fact it turned the archaeology suggests that the brick of that city was vitrified. It was turned to glass due to the intense heat of God. And one more interesting characteristic about God's intense heat and fire was that it was actually Kenyon. It was the person in the 1950s who actually disproved quote unquote, the count of Joshua in Jericho. But she did concede that there was 10-foot thick walls, right? 50-foot tall, 10-foot thick, and it was burnt through and through. Get that, 10-foot thick walls, and there's burn marks marked through and through. And that's the end of my lesson I have for you today. Joshua taking out 31 kings when God was on his side, and I just want you to be so encouraged that when God is on your side, what can happen and what kind of power God has. Never want to end any lesson without going to the plan of salvation, which is to hear, believe, repent of our sins, confess that Jesus Christ, Son of the living God, and then be baptized. Have a wonderful rest of your day and take care.